Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next episode of CIA, Catholic Investigative Agency. As we normally do for these, we have researched for hundreds of hours on this topic. We're talking about the Latin Mass, the Tridentine, traditional Latin Mass, the Tridentine Mass, and the Novus Ordo, a little history of how the Novus Ordo came to be, and why the Pope is making the traditional Latin Mass so much more available all of a sudden. If you're under 50 and you're in the church, a Catholic, you're sort of sitting there, what's all this about Latin Mass? I don't know anything about Latin Mass. Well, that's one of the reasons that we're doing this show, and a number of people in Rome are very interested in making sure that the message gets out about what is being called the reform of the reform, and we'll see a lot more of that as the years come along. You're going to see in the parishes in 2011 a good number of changes to just some of the responses that we make as people. That's all part of what's called the reform of the reform. We'll get into that a little bit later in the second part of our show. To give you an example of some of the research we did, all of these books up here and a number of articles, our research team, our crack research team has read various ones of these. We've had conference calls with people like Father Peter Stravinskas and Alice von Hildebrand. This is an exceedingly well-researched show, and it's hundreds of hours, articles, online articles, different major portions of these books, in some cases the entire books. So again, as we always tell you, we have hundreds of hours of research available. When you look at the final product here, the DVD of this, we will also have produced another information DVD that has all of the research on it, all the references to the books, the articles, all of that sort of thing. So again, we can't collapse 400 or 500 hours of research on stage here, not in the heat under these lights, but we sort of sum it up and give it to you in roughly an hour, and then hopefully you'll pick up the ball, learn much more about it yourself, and spread the word. I can assure you the Vatican and people of the Vatican want this reform of the reform being understood by the laity. So that's what we're going to get into now. We have a certain thesis. We begin every CIA show with a thesis. And our thesis for this episode of Catholic Investigative Agency is that certain individuals at Vatican II set about to destroy the theology of the Catholic Mass, which would ultimately destroy the Catholic Church. It's quite a bold statement. There's an old saying in the Church which sums up the connection between prayer and belief, and that is lex orandi, lex credendi. It's translated, the law of prayer is the law of belief. Now, there's an intimate connection, a very intimate connection, between how we pray and how we believe. Since the purported aim of these individuals was to destroy the faith, they had to first destroy the prayer of the Church, the highest form of the prayer of the Church, which is the Mass, the holy sacrifice of the Mass. In fact, many of those involved with the deformation of the Mass were not bashful at all about their work. One priest, for example, Father Joseph Guilleneau, he was a Vatican II Periti, we'll get into that in a moment, said, "This needs to be said without ambiguity. The Roman Rite, as we knew it, no longer exists. It has been destroyed." One of the leading opponents of the drastic changes at the council, Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, said, "They wanted to make a clean slate of the whole theology of the Mass. It ended up, in substance, quite close to the Protestant theology, which destroyed the sacrifice of the Mass." Now, these are all very high-ranking people at Vatican II. All the people behind the scenes, these are their comments. They knew what was going on. In the words of the famed and noted philosopher Dietrich von Hildebrand, truly, if one of the devils had been entrusted with the ruin of the liturgy, he could not have done a better job. So, let's present some history. In the 17th and 19th centuries, a heresy known as Jansenism began to appear in the church, largely in France. Jansenism was tied closely in its outlook to sort of the Protestant understanding of grace and predestination and man's relationship to God. The matter of fact, Jansenism sounded very much like the Protestant revolt of Martin Luther and John Calvin. It was named after its chief proponent, a Catholic bishop by the name of Cornelius Jansen. This corruption of Catholic theology, which is what every heresy is, began to express itself in strange liturgical innovations like dancing at the liturgy and prophetic utterances. Sound familiar? About liturgical dancing, Cardinal Ratzinger said, "Dancing is not a form of expression for the Christian liturgy." Take that to your parish worship committees as a quote. Write that down. These new rites, the jumping around, the prayer, the prophetic utterances, and the theology behind them began to gain popularity among many Catholics in the pews as time went by. The populace, regular people going to Mass every day, every Sunday, began moving away from the liturgy and the ecclesiastical forms and the tradition. In the middle of the 19th century, a Benedictine monk by the name of Dom Guéranger, he was the founder of the French congregation at Solesmes, he set about wanting to revitalize an appreciation for the Mass, which at the time was the Tridentine Mass. It was the previous Mass for the 1,300 years before that. It was the Mass. It was eventually codified by the Council of Trent in the middle of the 16th century. And remember, it was the only Mass there was. He's considered, Guéranger, is considered the founder of what became known as the new liturgical movement. But what it started out as is not how it ended up. A number of decades after his death, another Benedictine, Dom Baudat, took up the reins of the cause with an eye to transforming the liturgy itself. This was a departure from what Guéranger had thought. Guéranger had wanted to make the people understand, help them understand more the beauty and the depth of the Catholic Mass, to make it more meaningful to them so they would understand it more. That's how the new liturgical movement began. Baudat wanted to change the Mass itself, not get people's appreciation better, but to change the Mass itself in an effort to make it more ecumenical, more welcoming to Protestants. His thought was that if it was less Catholic, that more Protestants would say, that seems kind of nice. That seems at home to me. I think I'll go to that. As a lead-up to this, Baudat, experimented with all sorts of innovations in the Mass. He used to hold what he called these things himself, his naughty little retreats, where he would collect various like-minded priests and invent changes in the Mass. So they'd go off to these little places, these like remote places, and sit together and have like a little committee and figure out what changes to make in the Mass, and then they'd go through the Mass and celebrate the Mass with their little changes in it. These were happening in forests, monasteries or retreat centers buried deep in the forests of France and things like that. Word got out about this. His critics called them little orgies of liturgical ecumenism. Whatever the term, they were laboratories of change. Baudat is important to this whole discussion only insofar as what he does is he opens the door to changing the liturgy, changing the Mass, so that it could be more accepted by Protestants. That's why he's important in this. He died in 1960, but before he died, his idea and those of others had already crept in and began popping up here and there. We have a number of pictures here for you. Look at the monitors, please. These pictures were taken in the United States in various parishes in the 1950s. 1950s, some of them are from South Dakota. What was being experimented with, remember, this is 10 years or so before Vatican II and 12 to 15 years before the new Mass begins. But what do you see? Here's a couple bringing up the gifts. That never happens in the Tridentine Mass. Over here on the right, you see a picture of two young first communicants, little 7, 8-year-old boys, bringing up the gifts to who? Cardinal Cushing in Boston in the 1950s. A couple other pictures we have. This is a Mass and celebrated in a parish in South Dakota, and I believe it was 1954. I might be wrong on the year, but in the mid-50s, where the priest is actually facing the people. No ad orientem. This is 10, 15 years before the new Mass comes in. A couple other pictures we have here. On the left, you see nuns processing up the aisle, bringing up the gifts. Same thing in the middle picture. On the right-hand side, you see the priest, the main celebrant, going to the nuns right at the sanctuary and receiving the gifts. So these things were going on for a while. There was also a change to the liturgies of Holy Week. That happened in 1955. So the whole point of this is just to say that the liturgical changes that came roaring out of Vatican II didn't just drop out of the sky. They didn't come out of nowhere. They were already cropping up here and there. Now, there's a period in the Church, particularly in the beginning of the 20th